Close your eyes and take a deep breath. You are home now, and the world outside can wait. Welcome to another episode of Z in History. A young man from one family fell in love with a young woman from the family that opposed his people. The walls of Verona became the most dangerous thing in the world. This is the story of Romeo and Juliet. They met on the wrong night and decided that the feud between their houses did not matter, a decision that changed the city forever. The night air is warm and the streets are quiet. Settle in and let the story unfold. Chapter 1. The Fight in the Market Street. The trouble in Verona started the way trouble starts in crowded cities. Too many people in too small a space, and old insults passed down so many times that no one remembered who said them first. The Montague servants were walking through the market when they ran into the Capulet servants. In a city where your family name meant more than your character, running into the wrong person in the wrong street was enough to start a fight. It began with a gesture and a muttered word, something that would have been forgotten in any other town. But in Verona, it spread like a spark in dry grass. Servants called for backup. Merchants dragged their carts out of the way. People on balconies leaned over to see who was winning. Batons were drawn and blows were exchanged, and the market square became a tangle of arms and shouting before anyone in authority knew what was happening. This was how things worked in Verona. A single push could turn into a riot because everyone was carrying years of resentment. Resentment that had nothing to do with them personally and everything to do with the name they had been given at birth. The Prince of Verona arrived on horseback and called for order in a voice that cut through the noise. When the fighters scattered and the dust settled, he announced that the next person to disturb the peace would answer with their life. It was a warning that carried the weight of real authority, but also the sadness of a man who knew that warnings did not always stop people from doing what they were going to do anyway. Romeo was not there. He was the kind of young man who stayed away from fights even when his family was in them. But the line between Montague and Capulet had been drawn again in the blood on the cobblestones, and that line would matter to him more than he knew. Chapter 2. Romeo sighing over Rosaline. That same morning, Romeo was walking through the streets of Verona with his cousin Benvolio. He was sighing about a woman named Rosaline who did not love him back, and he was doing it with the kind of theatrical sadness that young men often mistake for depth of feeling. He had met Rosaline at a church gathering and decided she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. When she showed no interest in him, he concluded that the universe was cruel and that he would never be happy. His cousin found this both exhausting and amusing. Because Romeo fell in love with someone new roughly every 3 months, they walked past the Capulet house and Romeo looked at the walls as if the walls themselves were responsible for his suffering. Benvolio tried to tell him that there were other women in Verona, women who might actually return his affection. But Romeo was too wrapped up in his own performance to hear it. He spoke about love as if it were a sickness, and about Rosaline as if she were a goddess who had descended from heaven only to ignore him. There is nothing quite as tedious. As a young man who has decided his heartbreak is the most important thing in the world, especially when everyone around him knows he will get over it as soon as something more interesting comes along. Benvolio convinced him to go to the Capulet feast that night, not because Romeo wanted to see Capulets, but because Rosaline would be there. Romeo agreed because the idea of suffering in public felt more romantic than suffering alone in his room. Chapter 3. Crashing the Capulet Feast. The Capulet Feast was the event of the season in Verona. Grand affair with music and dancing and enough food to feed the entire district. The Montague boys decided to attend in masks, because there is nothing quite as exciting as walking into your enemy's house and pretending you belong there. Romeo put on a mask and followed his friends through the streets. He was nervous in the way anyone would be nervous walking into a room full of people raised to hate his family. But he was also excited the way young men get when they are about to break a rule and test the limits of what they can get away with. The hall was lit with torches and filled with Capulets in their finest clothes. Romeo moved through the crowd with his mask firmly in place, watching the dancers and the servants and the old men who sat in corners discussing business that no one else cared about. He was not looking for anything in particular when he walked into that room. He was just following his friends and trying not to draw attention. But the night was about to hand him something he was not prepared for. Something that would change the course of every decision he made from that moment forward. Old Capulet himself was there, welcoming guests and laughing with his friends. If anyone had known that a Montague was standing in their midst, the feast would have ended in blood instead of celebration. But the masks held and the night continued, and Romeo stayed hidden in plain sight. Chapter 4. Seeing Juliet across the room. Romeo saw Juliet across the crowded hall, and everything else in the room disappeared. Not in the poetic sense that young lovers describe when they want to sound profound. In a real and disorienting way that made him forget where he was and who he was supposed to be hiding from. She was standing near the far wall, talking to someone he could not see. There was something about the way she moved that held his attention in a way that Rosaline had never managed. He suddenly understood that everything he had felt before this moment had been a rehearsal. For the real thing, he asked the servant who she was. The servant told him she was Juliet, the daughter of the house, the Capulet heiress. The name landed in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. Because of all the women in all of Verona, the one who made him feel this way had to be the one he was not allowed to touch. He watched her dance and laugh and saw the way the candlelight caught her hair. He knew with the certainty of a young man who has never been truly tested that he would find a way to speak to her, even if it meant risking everything. That is what love does to young people. It makes them forget that consequences exist. A mask is a useful thing in a crowded room. It lets you look at someone without being recognized. But Romeo was about to learn that a mask cannot protect you from what happens when the person you are looking at decides to look back. Chapter 5. Tybalt recognizes Romeo's voice. Romeo found his way to Juliet, and they spoke for a few minutes. It was the kind of conversation that feels like it lasts both a second and a lifetime. In that brief exchange, something passed between them that neither had expected and neither could explain. Their hands touched and their eyes met. They spoke about things that did not matter, because the words themselves did not matter. Only the fact that they were speaking at all. For a few perfect moments, they were not Montague and Capulet. They were just two young people who had found something rare in a room full of noise. But Tybalt was watching from across the room. Juliet's cousin heard Romeo's voice and recognized it. Tybalt had been raised to know every enemy by sight and sound. He reported to old Capulet that a Montague was in the house and asked for permission to remove him. Capulet told him to let it be, that no good would come of disrupting the feast over a young man in a mask. Tybalt swallowed his anger, but did not swallow his hatred. He stored it away for another day. Romeo saw the tension pass across the room and understood he had been recognized. He slipped away from Juliet before the situation could turn violent, leaving her standing alone and confused at the edge of the dance floor. The warmth of his hand still lingered on hers. Chapter 6. The Promise on the Balcony. Romeo could not go home after the feast. His mind was still in that room with Juliet. He climbed the wall into the Capulet garden and stood beneath her balcony. The kind of reckless thing that people only do when they are too young to fully understand the danger. She appeared on the balcony, speaking to herself in the dark. She said his name and spoke about the unfairness of their families and the cruelty of a world that would keep them apart. He answered her from the shadows. The surprise on her face when she realized he was there was the most honest thing he had seen all night. They spoke for an hour in the dark, two voices crossing the gap between a garden and a balcony. They agreed that the feud was meaningless and that their families were wrong. The only thing that mattered was the feeling they had found in each other. She told him that if he meant what he said, he should send word tomorrow and they would find a way to be together. He promised her he would. It was the kind of promise that is easy to make in the dark. When the world feels like it belongs only to the two of you, he left before dawn and walked home through the empty streets with his heart pounding and his mind racing. The balcony stood silent above the garden, holding the echo of their voices until the morning birds began to sing. Chapter 7. The Secret Wedding in the Chapel. Romeo went straight to Friar Lawrence the next morning. He asked the friar to marry them in secret. The old man greeted the request with raised eyebrows, because he had seen Romeo in love 3 times in the past year, and each time it had ended with the same dramatic collapse. But when Romeo explained that it was Juliet Capulet, not Rosaline, and that the marriage could end the feud between the two houses, the friar paused. He considered the possibility that this might be the hand of God. Working in strange ways, Juliet met them at the chapel that afternoon. She arrived through the back streets with her nurse as chaperone. They were married in a simple ceremony with no music and no guests and no celebration. Just a few words spoken in Latin and a ring placed on a finger and a kiss that tasted like both relief and fear. The friar blessed them and warned them to be careful. He told them that love was patient, but patience was not always enough when the world was pressing in from all sides. They promised to be careful, the way young people always promise before they do something reckless. They parted at the chapel door. Juliet returned to the Capulet house with her secret tucked inside her dress. Romeo walked through the streets of Verona with a wife he could not acknowledge and a future that had no clear shape yet. Chapter 8. Mercutio falls in the street. The afternoon heat brought trouble to the streets of Verona. Tybalt found Romeo and demanded satisfaction for the insult at the feast. It was the kind of confrontation that had been waiting to happen since the moment Romeo had walked into the Capulet house wearing that mask. Romeo refused to fight. Tybalt was now his cousin by marriage, even if Tybalt did not know it. He stood there taking insults that would have made any other man draw his blade, trying to keep the peace that he had promised his new wife. but Mercutio could not stand to see Romeo back down. He stepped forward to take the fight instead, drawing his blade and facing Tybalt with the kind of reckless courage that young men mistake for honor. The fight was quick and brutal. When it was over, Mercutio was on the ground with a wound that should not have been fatal but turned out to be. He looked at Romeo with something between anger and affection and cursed both the houses before he died. Romeo's vow of peace broke in that moment. He chased Tybalt down the street and they fought. When it was over, Tybalt was dead on the cobblestones and Romeo was standing over him with a bloody blade. He understood that everything had changed in the space of a few minutes, and nothing could ever go back to the way it was. Chapter 9. The Banishment and the New Betrothal. The prince kept his promise and banished Romeo from Verona instead of executing him. It was a decision that felt like mercy to everyone except Romeo, who understood that being sent away from Juliet was worse than death. He spent his last night in the city hidden in her room, holding her and apologizing and promising to come back for her. She cried against his chest and asked him not to leave, even though both of them knew that leaving was the only option left. He left at dawn and the city gates closed behind him. Juliet returned to her room, feeling like the walls were pressing in from all sides. That was when her father told her she would marry Paris, a wealthy suitor who had been waiting for her hand since before the feast. She refused and her father raged. The house became a battlefield of its own, with a daughter who could not explain why she would not marry and a father who could not understand why she was being difficult. The nurse who had helped her marry Romeo now told her to forget him and marry Paris. It was advice that broke something inside her, because even the people she trusted were telling her to give up. She was alone in the city that had raised her, married to a man who was gone, promised to a man she did not want. The walls of Verona had never felt so high. Chapter 10. The Potion That Fakes Death. Juliet went to Friar Lawrence as a last resort. The friar gave her a vial of liquid and a plan that was both brilliant and terrifying, because it depended on everything going exactly right. The potion would put her into a sleep so deep that everyone would think she was dead. She would be placed in the family tomb. Romeo would be sent for. He would be there when she woke up, and they would escape together to Mantua, where he was waiting. She took the vial home and drank it that night. She lay down in her bed with her heart racing and her hands shaking, wondering if the potion would actually work or if she had just poisoned herself for nothing. The question followed her into the darkness as the sleep took her. The nurse found her the next morning and the house erupted in grief. The wedding clothes were put away and the funeral was prepared. The body of Juliet Capulet was laid in the family tomb while her mother wept and her father aged 10 years in a single day. The message was sent to Romeo, the message that would tell him to come back. The plan was in motion. But the distance between Verona and Mantua turned out to be longer than anyone had calculated, and the road had a way of swallowing messages that were meant to save lives. Chapter 11. The Message That Never Arrives. The friar's message never reached Romeo. The messenger was delayed at the city gates by a quarantine, a bureaucratic detail that no one could have predicted. Instead, the news that reached Romeo was delivered by Balthasar, a servant who had seen Juliet's funeral with his own eyes and ridden hard to tell his master that she was dead. Romeo heard the words and did not question them. Why would a servant lie about something like that? He made a decision in that moment that he would not wait for a world that had taken everything from him. He bought poison from an apothecary in a back alley, paying a fortune for a vial of liquid that was illegal to sell but impossible to resist buying. He wrote a letter to his father explaining what had happened and rode through the night toward Verona with the poison tucked inside his coat. The road was dark and the horse was fast, and his mind was filled with images of Juliet lying cold in the tomb. He did not allow himself to wonder if there might be another explanation. Wondering would mean hoping, and hoping was too painful to bear. The gates of Verona appeared in the distance, and he pushed the horse harder. He arrived in the city as the sun was setting. Too late to stop the funeral, but just in time for the tragedy that was about to unfold. Chapter 12. Everyone meets in the tomb. Romeo reached the Capulet tomb in the dark of night. He carried a torch and a crowbar, and a heart that had already stopped believing that anything good could happen. He forced the door open and stepped into the cold stone chamber, where the bodies of the Capulets were laid in their final rest. He found Juliet on a stone slab, pale and still. He spoke to her one last time, telling her that he was coming, that she would not be alone, that the world that had tried to keep them apart had failed because he would follow her wherever she went. Paris was already there, having come to mourn the woman he had wanted to marry. He confronted Romeo, and they fought among the tombs until Paris fell. Romeo recognized him and laid him beside Juliet with a gentleness that surprised even himself. He drank the poison and kissed Juliet one last time and waited for the darkness to take him. It did. He died beside the woman who had changed everything. Not knowing that she was not dead, but sleeping, she woke a few minutes later and found Romeo cold beside her. She understood without anyone telling her what had happened. The look on his face told her everything. She took his dagger and joined him in the silence. The guards found them in the morning. The Capulets and Montagues stood together at the tomb. The feud that had lasted for generations ended in a room full of people who had finally understood that the cost of their hatred had been paid in full.